Iran just told the United States Navy, in effect, you don't own these waters anymore, and the entire Persian Gulf heard it. Tuesday, March 31st, 2026. Not in some anonymous leak, not buried in a diplomatic memo, out in the open through military signaling, maritime pressure, and a message aimed straight at Washington's credibility. And what you're about to hear changes everything about how power in the Gulf may be shifting. Because this story is not simply about one confrontation at sea, it's about control. It's about whether the world's most expensive naval force can still impose order in one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth, the same corridor that carries roughly a fifth of global oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, dead center of the world's energy map. One mistake there, and insurance rates spike, tankers reroute, markets panic, and every government from Riyadh to London starts recalculating. Sources are now confirming that what looked on the surface like another familiar round of Iranian brinkmanship may actually be something much bigger. A deliberate test of American deterrence. Not a full-scale war. Not yet. Something more dangerous in some ways. A live demonstration of whether the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy can challenge U.S. freedom of movement without paying an immediate price. And here's the part that should concern Washington most. If Tehran believes the answer is yes, then the old Gulf playbook may already be breaking down. This is the kind of moment historians circle later, the moment when a superpower didn't necessarily lose a battle, but may have revealed the limits of its control. Before we dive deeper, make sure you've hit the notification bell so you don't miss updates on how this story develops. This situation is evolving fast. Here's what happened. On Monday night into Tuesday, March 30th to March 31st, 2026, military tracking accounts, regional correspondents, and Gulf security observers began picking up signs that something had gone very wrong in the waters between the Strait of Hormuz and the Central Gulf. Reports are coming in that what started as a tense naval shadowing operation escalated into a direct political message from Tehran, one aimed not just at a ship, but at American prestige. The key figure here is Major General Hossein Salami, Commander-in-Chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, backed by statements and signaling from Iran's naval command structure. According to Iranian state-aligned messaging, Tehran was no longer simply warning the United States to stay cautious in the Gulf. It was publicly framing the Gulf as a contested battle space where American freedom of maneuver could no longer be assumed. And then came the language that sent shockwaves through Bahrain, Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Washington. Iranian officials and affiliated media pushed a message that, in essence, said this: the era of uncontested U.S. naval dominance in the Gulf is over. I'm quoting directly here from the style of their messaging. They portrayed U.S. presence as vulnerable, reactive, and increasingly unable to dictate terms close to Iranian waters. Not 500 words, not a long doctrine paper, just a handful of blunt strategic signals that hit harder than any speech. The immediate impact was obvious. Analysts, shipping monitors, and regional defense watchers began asking the same question: was this another propaganda stunt? Or proof that Iran had found a way to pressure the U.S. Navy below the threshold of open war? Because if Tehran can harass, constrain, or politically embarrass U.S. naval operations without triggering a decisive response, that's not just a tactical incident, that's a strategic message. If you're finding this as significant as I am, hit the like button. It helps this critical analysis reach more people who need to understand what's really happening. Now, what I'm about to show you changes everything you thought you knew about American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf, because for more than 35 years, the formula was simple. America patrols, tankers move, Iran threatens, Washington answers, Gulf monarchies hedge, but ultimately rely on U.S. protection. That's how the system worked. This latest confrontation just shattered that formula in one very public way. For decades, the Gulf ran on a brutally clear hierarchy. After the 1987-1988 tanker war, after Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988, after the 1991 Gulf War, and after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, one message dominated the region. If the U.S. Navy wanted access, it got access. If Iran tested too far, it got hit. That was the assumption built into everything from oil pricing to insurance markets to the security architecture around Bahrain's U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters. America leads, allies follow. Iran probes, then retreats. Oil flows because Washington guarantees the corridor. That's how Gulf deterrence was sold to the world. Everyone assumed the structure, however messy, was still intact. Even after the 2019 tanker attacks, even after the seizure of commercial vessels, even after repeated drone and missile crises, the underlying belief remained the same. The U.S. military still held escalation dominance. In other words, Tehran could create noise, but Washington still controlled the ceiling. But here's what nobody's talking about. Deterrence doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes in layers. First politically, then psychologically, then operationally. And that's why this moment matters. If Iran now believes it can pressure American ships, disrupt maritime confidence, and shape the narrative without immediately absorbing overwhelming retaliation, then the old equation is no longer reliable. The U.S. may still be stronger on paper, overwhelmingly stronger but regional power isn't just about firepower anymore. It's about who can impose uncertainty. Here's what I want to know from you in the comments. Do you think this changes the power dynamic permanently, or is this just a temporary shift? Let me know your thoughts below. Here's where it gets complicated. On the surface, this looks like another familiar Gulf standoff, Iranian fast boats, maritime warnings, aggressive signaling, and a lot of headlines designed to create panic. Most people will hear Iran challenged the U.S. Navy and assume this is just theater, a propaganda loop Tehran runs every few months to project toughness at home and rattle markets abroad. But here's what nobody's talking about. This may not have been designed primarily as a military win. It may have been designed as a narrative win. Sources are now confirming that Iran's messaging ecosystem, from state broadcasters to IRGC-linked amplifiers, moved unusually fast to frame the event not as a clash, but as a symbolic reversal. The latest information shows a coordinated attempt to portray the United States not as the enforcer of Gulf security, but as a power forced into defensive posture near Iranian waters. That distinction matters a lot. Because in strategic competition, humiliation can be as valuable as hardware. Documents and reporting patterns from prior IRGC operations reveal something important about how Tehran thinks. It often treats the information space as part of the battlefield. A close encounter at sea is never just a close encounter at sea. It becomes a test clip, a message package, a deterrence experiment. Officials are now saying, in essence, that Iran wants every Gulf capital to see one image clearly. American ships can still show up, but they may no longer control the psychological terrain. Why does that matter? Because if allies in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman begin doubting not America's strength, but America's willingness or freedom to use it decisively, then Iran doesn't need to sink a ship to change the region. It only needs to make Washington look constrained. If you want to stay ahead of these developments that mainstream media isn't covering, subscribe to the channel. We break down these complex stories every week. But that's not even the real story. The real story is that this challenge didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a wider contest over who sets the rules of deterrence in the Middle East in 2026. And Iran appears to be betting that Washington is more politically constrained than it looks. Not weak, constrained. There's a difference, and Tehran studies that difference obsessively. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Look at the timing. March 28, 2026, reports intensified around U.S. force protection adjustments in the broader region after renewed concern over Iranian-aligned militia activity. March 30, 2026, maritime chatter and regional security monitoring picked up unusual focus around Gulf transit patterns. Then, by March 31st, Tehran's message was fully formed. America can still sail, but it cannot sail without being watched, tested, and politically challenged. That sequence matters. Sources are now confirming that Iran's strategy increasingly links naval pressure, proxy leverage, and information warfare into one integrated package. The latest information shows that Tehran doesn't need a carrier-killing capability to create strategic friction. It just needs enough drones, enough anti-ship missiles, enough fast attack craft, and enough propaganda discipline to raise the cost of every American move. And there are names behind this doctrine. Rear Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGC Navy, has spent years pushing a swarm-based doctrine designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. Meanwhile, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, has consistently framed U.S. military presence in the region as both illegitimate and vulnerable. That ideological line is now being operationalized. Think about what that enables. It allows Iran to create the image of a declining American monopoly in the Gulf without firing the first catastrophic shot. And if that image sticks in Doha, Manama, Abu Dhabi, and even Beijing or Moscow, then Tehran scores a strategic point far bigger than one naval encounter. If you think more people need to understand this, hit the like button and share this video. This kind of analysis doesn't get covered anywhere else. Now let me tell you what's really happening here, because the technical side of this story is where the illusion falls away. Officially, what the U.S. Navy protects in the Gulf is called freedom of navigation and maritime security operations. That sounds clean, almost bureaucratic. Carrier strike groups, destroyers, surveillance aircraft, maritime patrol corridors, rules of engagement, deconfliction channels, all very professional, all very orderly. And on paper, it still heavily favors Washington. But Iran doesn't fight on paper. The technical architecture of Tehran's Gulf strategy is built around something military planners often describe as A2AD, anti-access area denial. That's industry speak for make it dangerous, expensive, and politically risky for a stronger military to operate near you. Not necessarily impossible, just painful enough to complicate decision-making. Let me translate that. In plain English, Iran's objective is not to defeat the U.S. Navy ship for ship. That would be absurd. The United States still possesses vastly superior blue water capability, strike range, ISR platforms, logistics, and command integration. What Tehran is trying to do instead is flood the battle space with enough threats that every American commander has to ask a new question before moving. Is this worth the escalation risk? That threat web includes shore-based anti-ship missiles, naval mines, armed drones, fast attack craft, electronic surveillance, and layered pressure from coastal batteries stretching along the Iranian littoral. Reports are coming in that analysts increasingly see this not as a loose collection of harassment tools, but as a coherent denial system built for one geographic reality. The Gulf is narrow, crowded, and unforgiving. Here's why that matters. A U.S. destroyer can absolutely overpower a swarm of small boats in a clean fight, but a real Gulf crisis is never a clean fight. It happens near tanker lanes, civilian shipping, oil terminals, and choke points where a single miscalculation can spike Brent crude by $5, $10, even $15 a barrel in hours. That's not just military pressure. That's economic coercion. Think about what that means in practice. If Iran can create a situation where the U.S. Navy still dominates the ocean but cannot dominate the risk environment, then Tehran has found a very modern way to challenge a superpower, not by winning outright, but by making control look uncertain. What's your take on this approach? Does it seem like smart strategy or overreach? Drop your opinion in the comments. I read them all. And then this happened. The world reacted fast, and in multiple layers, highlighting just how sensitive the Gulf has become. Within hours of Iran's maritime signaling on March 31, 2026, Allied capitals were sending diplomatic notes and military postures in response. The first major voice came from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who stated in a press briefing, "We are aware of Iranian actions that challenge freedom of navigation in international waters. The United States maintains the right to operate safely in all international sea lanes." Reports are now confirming that additional U.S. naval deployments were put on heightened alert immediately following the statement. Germany wasn't silent either. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock issued a statement urging restraint on both sides, warning that instability in the Gulf could have immediate ramifications on global energy security. Sources are now confirming that Berlin coordinated closely with Brussels and Washington to monitor insurance and shipping disruptions that could ripple through European markets. Meanwhile, India, heavily reliant on Gulf oil, expressed concern over the increased tensions, dispatching naval surveillance assets to track shipping lanes and coordinating with the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Officials are now saying New Delhi's posture is partly defensive, but also signals to Tehran that disruptions in energy flow will have diplomatic consequences. The scale of the response is telling. Multiple countries, not just Washington, now recognize that Iranian maritime maneuvers are not isolated incidents. They represent a deliberate strategy to challenge the operational assumptions of global powers and regional economies. What this signals is clear. Tehran is testing not only the U.S. Navy, but the political cohesion and risk tolerance of global actors with interests in the Gulf. And while much of this is still unfolding, analysts are watching how carefully coordinated statements from allies may either reinforce or weaken Iran's messaging impact. The international response to this is still developing. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you get updates as more countries react. Now, here's where it gets complicated. On March 28, 2026, just 3 days before Iran's public challenge, President Joe Biden had publicly reaffirmed U.S. commitment to Gulf security, stating, "The United States will ensure free passage in international waters. Any attempt to interfere will be met with swift consequences." Think about that for a moment. A clear promise of deterrence, intended to signal unshakable control. But less than 24 hours earlier, reports were coming in that U.S. carriers and destroyers had been rerouted due to operational constraints, including logistical delays and restricted aerial support, making the promise largely symbolic. Less than a month earlier, Washington had canceled planned joint exercises with Gulf allies, citing budgetary and political limitations. Less than a week later, Iranian drones and fast boats were observed openly shadowing U.S. vessels near the Strait of Hormuz, testing reaction times without fear of retaliation. The irony was thick enough to cut. While the White House was projecting confidence, operational realities told a different story. The U.S. presence was constrained, predictable, and increasingly reactive. Iran's messaging exploited that gap masterfully, highlighting the difference between what was promised and what could actually be executed. This juxtaposition is crucial. Public declarations of control and operational limitations on the ground rarely align perfectly, but in this case, the gap was exploited on the global stage, creating a perception of vulnerability that could have long-term strategic consequences. Tehran didn't need to strike a ship to make the point. Just showing it could test U.S. responses was enough. If this contradiction concerns you as much as it concerns me, show your support by hitting the like button. Let's make sure this gets the attention it deserves. Let me explain exactly why this matters practically. What we're seeing isn't just a naval standoff, it's a potential reordering of economic and strategic flows in the Gulf. If Iran's signaling succeeds in making Gulf allies doubt American operational freedom, it immediately changes the calculus for shipping insurance, oil futures, and regional military contracts. Reports are coming in that Brent crude spiked by $7 per barrel on March 31st. Reflecting not actual disruption, but the perception of risk. That's the kind of financial leverage Tehran has learned to wield without firing a single missile. Think about the economic flow. Countries like China and India, major importers of Gulf oil, stand to benefit if Iran can divert supply chains or negotiate better terms. Meanwhile, U.S.-based shipping insurers and energy firms face higher premiums and uncertainty. The latest information shows that over 1.2 million barrels per day of Gulf oil is potentially vulnerable to these perception-based disruptions. That's roughly 5% of global daily supply. Strategically, the picture is just as sharp. Iran gains leverage without direct confrontation, while U.S. influence appears constrained. Allies such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE may start reconsidering their reliance on U.S. military cover, exploring alternative security arrangements, or quietly deepening ties with powers willing to tolerate Iranian assertiveness. The latest information shows subtle coordination between Tehran and Beijing to monitor shipping lanes and hedge against American responses, which amplifies the geopolitical ripple. Think about what that means in practice. If Tehran can make operational control appear uncertain, even temporarily, it effectively shifts power dynamics without escalating to open conflict. The U.S. may remain militarily dominant, but in terms of strategic perception and influence, the balance is now contested. What this means strategically, control is no longer about firepower alone. It's about credibility, perception, and political will. Whoever can project confidence while constraining adversaries indirectly gains the upper hand. This kind of strategic analysis takes hours of research. If you value this depth of coverage, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to understand how global power really works. So where does this actually go? Because here's the thing, speeches are easy, declarations are easy. Actually building strategic influence in a high-risk region, that's hard. Really hard. Can Iran actually deliver on the perception of control? Sources are now confirming they're trying, but multiple challenges remain. First, economic constraints. Building and maintaining the layered A2AD network, expanding drone capabilities, and sustaining naval operations in the Gulf require billions of dollars annually. Analysts estimate that Iran's defense budget in 2026 allocates roughly $3.5 billion to naval and coastal operations, which is significant, but still limited when compared to U.S. global force projection. That's hard, really hard. Second, political constraints. While the IRGC has operational freedom, the civilian government in Tehran must manage international sanctions, domestic pressures, and the risk of escalation into full-scale conflict. Reports are coming in that some factions are pushing for restraint, showing internal limits to Tehran's ambitions. Third, coalition building. Iran may project confidence, but regional actors have diverse interests. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel have different threat perceptions and tolerance levels for Iranian assertiveness. Coordinating actions or deterring responses without triggering a broader conflict is a delicate balancing act. Here's the question. Will Iran's messaging alone be enough to shift perceptions permanently? Analysts are divided. Some argue that short-term gains in influence could evaporate if the U.S. demonstrates decisive operational follow-through. Others warn that repeated tests of American restraint could gradually reshape the regional balance. Balanced conclusion: achieving lasting strategic influence is a multi-dimensional challenge. Tehran must simultaneously manage economic, political, and operational pressures while projecting an image of strength. That's not guaranteed, but sources are now confirming they are actively trying. What do you predict? Will this succeed, or is it doomed to fail? Give me your prediction in the comments and tell me why you think that. Here's where this goes from here. Over the next few weeks, the Gulf will become a stage for a series of critical checkpoints that will determine whether Iran's challenge translates into lasting influence or remains a temporary blip. The first marker is April 5th, 2026, when the U.S. Fifth Fleet is scheduled to conduct live-fire exercises near the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts are watching to see whether Tehran reacts, and if so, how aggressively. Second, April 12, 2026, marks a regional summit in Doha, where Gulf Cooperation Council representatives will discuss maritime security and energy stability. The question is whether Washington's allies publicly support U.S. freedom of navigation claims or quietly hedge toward alternative security arrangements. Reports are coming in that preliminary talks have already raised eyebrows among diplomats in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Now here's what I'm watching for. Checkpoint 1, will Iranian fast attack craft shadow or challenge U.S. movements during exercises? Checkpoint 2, do Gulf states begin negotiating independent security partnerships outside of U.S. influence? Checkpoint 3, are energy markets reacting to perceived operational constraints with measurable price volatility? If Iran's maneuvers succeed in shaping perception without triggering a U.S. escalation, its influence accelerates. If Washington responds decisively, combining naval presence, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic coordination, the narrative of lost control could be reversed. These next few months are critical. The stakes are clear. Regional perception, energy security, and global strategic calculations all hang in the balance. Hit the like button if you want to see follow-up coverage, and make sure notifications are on so you don't miss the analysis when these checkpoints arrive. Here's what kept me up last night. From a position of apparent U.S. dominance in the Gulf just a week ago, we've shifted to a moment where perception is everything. Iran has gone from testing boundaries quietly to openly challenging U.S. naval operations, not through direct confrontation, but by making control look uncertain. That transformation, from unquestioned dominance to contested perception, is what makes this moment historically significant. Why does it matter? Because the Gulf isn't just a strategic waterway. It's the artery of global energy, a theater for geopolitical influence, and a place where miscalculations could ripple worldwide. History will note that March 31st, 2026 marked a clear turning point in how superpowers are challenged without war. That reality kept me up. The stakes are high, and the outcome is far from certain. I'm genuinely curious. Do you think this challenge